So just to introduce myself, as this is my first time on a webinar with the Cyber Lounge, my name is Akash. I'm a recruitment consultant here at West Point Cyber Talent. And today I am really excited to introduce Peadar Callaghan, who's a university lecturer with a love for gamification. He'll be teaching us on how narrative gamification can be used to seriously increase engagement in cybersecurity training. When the stakes are so high as they are in 2021, having people both aware and engaged when training is absolutely essential. There'll be plenty of time for any questions you have regarding Peadar's talk, so please submit them through the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen or in the chat, and we'll get to them shortly. With that said, over to you, Peadar.
Okay. Hi, everybody. So as Akash was just saying, my name is Peadar Callaghan. To give you a little bit of detail about myself, I am currently a lecturer at the University of Tallinn. I teach both game design, learning game design, and gamification courses. With the gamification, I teach both undergraduate and postgraduate levels, and I also teach a gamification for small and medium enterprises that is sponsored by the Estonian government. In what free time I have, I enjoy studying games and working on my own thesis about learning games. And I also consult on game design for cybersecurity. Last week, I had a meeting, a knowledge share session with NATO Cybersecurity Command, talking about how to use, correctly leverage game design elements into their training program. I am not an expert in cybersecurity. I am, however, an expert on games and how games can be used in the field of teaching, which means that I am able to translate what technological experts see on one side into something that can then be actionable by people, by management and those without the major training. Okay. I've also been a lecturer for about 15 years, teaching at universities all over the place, and I started off as a language lecturer. So let's get started into this. First of all, I have the talk structured out into 4 basic steps. The first step, we're going to take a look at an overview. Then we're going to take a look at some of the basic principles of gamification. Then we're going to focus in on narrative gamification. And then finally, we'll have time for some takeaways, some questions and answers. In the overview, we're first going to, if we jump back a little, we're first going to look at what is gamification, the definition. We're going to explain very briefly why it's useful to have it. We're going to then subdivide it down into finite and infinite gamification so that we can understand what those two terms mean, those key terms mean. And then we're going to look at points and badges, which are used in both finite and infinite gamification. And finally, going into kernels and satellites and storytelling, character, plot, and setting, and what I've found really useful by focusing in on 2 pseudo plots. These are frameworks to help you design a course so that it follows a narrative structure. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. Next slide, please. Okay, so gamification is most commonly defined as the use of game design elements or creating game-like emotions in a non-game context. So what it is it's an additive process. In most of the design elements out there in the modern world, you are trying to strip out as many extraneous things as possible. You're trying to take part in what is known as Taylorism. You're trying to get the action that is done by the people down to the simplest discrete actions. And you're trying to then just get them to just do one action repetitively to increase the effectiveness of it. The problem with this is it's incredibly boring. Gamification, on the other hand, adds complexity into an otherwise simple system to encourage people to think about it and to become engaged by thinking about it. You're endeavoring to make sure that people are being engaged mentally and not being able to just make the process automatic so that they can zone out. Next slide, please. So why should you include gamification in your training? Well, the first and most important thing is because you're adding this extra layer on top, it forces you to think about what you are actually trying to do. There is a principle called the stated curriculum, which is what is written down in your documents, the intended learning outcomes. Students will be able to do this, and this by the end of this particular training session. However, often there is a hidden curriculum. And this is what is actually happening inside the classroom and is what is happening inside the student. You've got the stated curriculum, which has your goals, and you have the actual curriculum, which is what happens in the classroom, but the hidden curriculum is what's happening up inside somebody's head. As you're adding complexity to an otherwise simple system, it forces you to look at that system and ask yourself what each of these steps are adding to the process and how it is improving on the process. Gamification also, it provides a transparent feedback system for the participant. I know that if I do this, then this action is going to happen. I can start to predict how things are going to interrelate to each other. I can't predict them perfectly, because if I can predict them perfectly, it becomes boring. But I can begin to make assumptions. I can begin to make guesses and estimates based on what it is that I am seeing happening from my stimulus to the response. So because of this, this increases the amount that your players and your participants are going to engage with the material, because suddenly it's not just a choice between A and B and it has no relevance. The choice between A and B has a relevance and it has an importance that feeds into itself and keeps moving it forward, at which point you're going to spend more time thinking about, do I choose A or do I choose B? It also creates what is known in education as stealth assessment. Because you have decided on, here are the predictors, here are the point system, here's the point system, I can actually then take the data from it and go, okay, this person reached this point level at this point, at this timeline. This person reached it at this timeline. This person went for this pathway. This person went for this pathway. This can give me much finer excuse me, can give me a much more granular vision of what the learning process that is taking place, rather than me having to stop the learning process in its tracks to evaluate things as it goes onward. Move on to the next slide. So there are two basic types of gamification out there, the finite and the infinite. The infinite gamification is the type that you're most likely to have come across. This is things like the status marathons of the frequent flyer point systems or the air mile systems on credit cards. The system is designed to try to keep you in the system forever, as long as possible. So for an infinite system, they're just trying to keep you going along in this loop. So the person does the behavior that the system wants to reinforce. The person gets a reward. The person gets incentivized to do the behavior again. Person does the behavior again, gets a reward, gets incentivized. And the object of a infinite gamification is to just keep you moving around in that loop. The problem is that once that loop becomes predictable, it becomes what in game design is known as a solved game. Once we have a solved game, it stops becoming engaging, it stops becoming interesting, it stops becoming involving. So the infinite loops tend to put in delays and surprise mechanics and novelty elements, all in an effort to maintain that interest, to keep you cycling back through the system. Finite systems are different in that they have an end condition attached to it. This means that it has a start and it has an end goal. And this is much more common for what it is that we're looking for when we're engaging with any form of training program out there. We have a start time, we have an end time. We're not looking to keep the person cycling through the system constantly for the rest of their life. We're just trying to get them from position A to position B while getting them to engage through it. What we're going to be talking about with this finite gamification system is the use of narrative to help us define the steps through the process and to understand how we can put those time limits in place and get them to work together in that way. Move on to the next slide. So that was our definition. We've got an idea of what gamification is. We have an idea of what narrative of finite and infinite gamification is. But both of those use the same basic system. And if I was to simplify it into a 5-step process for creating a gamified system, no matter if it's a finite or an infinite, you would go through these basic steps. First of all, you understand the observable actions that the participants are going to take inside your system. So you sketch out the verbs. So they're going to post, they're going to read, they're going to click, they're going to like, they're going to share. You map out all of the actions that the player can take within the system. From there, we move on to looking at which actions are predictors of positive outcome. Which actions do we think are going to reflect somebody who is engaging with the system and who is actively learning? And then we rank them. So this action is the most important for my system. This action is the second most important. This is the third most important. And by doing so, we're creating a hierarchy of what it is that we want our participants to do. From there, once we've figured out which are the most important, we move into assigning a point system to them. And the point system, there are experience points, redeemable points, skill points, reputation points, or karma points. Deciding on which point system you use will affect the system as well. Then you decide on how you're going to display how these points have been acquired. Are you going to use badges, leaderboards? Are you going to use another mechanics? And you think about the reward methodology that you're putting in place. And the reward methodology, the easiest way to describe it is SAPS. Status, access, power, and stuff. Finally, you put that all together, you do all that thinking work, and you put it all down on paper, and then you create a paper prototype and you test it because you want to iterate on a testable system as fast as possible. Now, what does this have to do with cybersecurity? Not a huge amount at the moment because what we're designing is a system that could be used for any educational purpose. Cybersecurity, however, requires a much higher level of engagement and thought if we want our participants to internalize the messages. People are not going to be internalizing the messages and making them actionable if they are only being exposed to a chalk and talk methodology. So we need an active and engaging learning environment. Without that, we are in serious trouble when it comes to getting people to understand and work with the materials. Next slide, please. Okay, so when we start thinking about our course or our training program, we start thinking about the steps that people are going to take. And there are different ways that we can organize those steps. And there are different ways that we can reward those steps. One of the quickest ways to do this is to think of what are the milestones and try to come up with 5 milestone steps throughout the course. So the first milestone is this, the second milestone is this, the third is this, and then the final one is this, fourth and final one. And then you can start to organize them. If we look at the top left of the screen there, we've got the standard learning pathway, which is first 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. However, it doesn't have to be structured like this. We have an options of the one immediately underneath, where we have what is known as the side quest model, where we give the people an opportunity to make a decision point and go and explore a different branch and then come back before they go to the other one. Then we have pyramidal structures. We have ring structures that we can put into place, which are unidirectional or multi-directional. With the pyramid structure, we start off, and you can start off at any one of the start points on level 1, but then it collapses down to level 2 and then collapses down again to a capstone. So everybody is doing the capstone exercise. If we reverse that, we can end up with a expanding structure where the person starts off with everybody doing the same activity to start with, and then they have a choice: do they go in this direction or do they go in this direction, and branching out. So you can organize the structure of the learning by thinking a little bit about this idea of what are the key elements that I am recognizing through the system. Let's move on to the next slide. Okay, so now let's start talking a little bit about narrative. Because believe it or not, we've already been discussing a little bit about narrative when we're talking about this idea of putting badges through micro-accreditation throughout the thing. There are 3 elements that are essential for any story. You must have character, plot, and setting. Character is a who, plot is a what are they doing, and a setting is where does it happen. You have to have these things thought out and put into place to help to engage with the system, to help the person to work it through. It is not a story to say the king died and then the queen died. That is not a story. Because while it does have characters, it doesn't have a plot. It doesn't have a thing that is happening. Now, if I was to say the king died and then the queen died of a broken heart, suddenly we have a narrative forming there because we're giving a reason why. We're adding more detail. And people love detail when it's added correctly. It encourages people to engage more and more with the learning and interest in general. Move on to the next slide. So the thing about cybersecurity, specifically with narrative, is we have this problem, which is the extreme fog of war. So as we're talking about the character, the first urge amongst many people in cybersecurity is to keep it simple and to just go, okay, it's a cyber attack that is being done by this person, this type of person. Well, the problem is that this is an assumption that can get you into a lot of trouble. A lot of the design of the enemy for training programs and for security reasons are based on Norbert Wiener's concept of the ontology of the enemy. Namely, that your enemy is known, rational, and ruthless. The problem is in cyber attacks, it is incredibly rare for the enemy to be known. And if you cannot know who the enemy is, you are not going to be able to be aware of whether or not they are acting rationally and whether or not they are acting ruthlessly. The extreme fog of war problem in cybersecurity is something that I have written on for both the Strife blog and the InfoSec blogs with my co-author Amy Ayrton. And it causes problems when we're trying to use these game mechanics to engage with it. When you're starting off and you're thinking about character to put narrative gamification in place for your training program, you have to remember that while you have to know everything about the character, you shouldn't reveal everything about the character to the participant immediately, because this interferes with the learning process. You have to slowly build it upward and outward. Let's move on to the next slide, where we're going to start talking about, next slide. Where we're going to start talking about this idea of plotting. And plotting can be an incredibly useful tool. If we take one of the classic plots, we have Joseph Campbell's monomyth, and he describes 8 distinct stages. And if we can map our 8 learning goals to the 8 distinct phases, well, then we suddenly have a much clearer outline of what it is we're trying to teach. The monomyth from Campbell is incredibly useful, but it tends to be overused. Slightly more useful and much better is Christopher Booker's concept of the 7 basic plots, because he actually breaks down the plots into something that is best described as a pseudoplot, a understanding of what it is. Let's move on. So let's take a look at some examples. 2 of the plots that Booker references are Overcoming the Monster and The Voyage and Return. In Overcoming the Monster, the player is in the world or community X when he or she becomes aware of the deadly threat of Y, who wants to destroy X. The player must gather resources, learn skills to prepare to confront Y. Just as everything is going well, Y strikes, the player must fight with no guarantee of success. When victory is achieved, X is saved. The Voyage and Return, the player is thrown into a strange world X. At first, X is puzzling and unusual as the player tries to figure out the rules of this new world. Slowly, however, X begins to change and become more frustrating or difficult or dangerous. Just as the world X starts to become a serious threat, the player finds an escape, having been changed by the experience. If we think about this briefly for a second, what we can see is that the Overcoming the Monster pseudoplot is actually a fundamental pattern that we can see in most summative assessment forms of training. The player starts off here. They must gather, they learn about the threat of the exam here. And next, they gather their resources, learn the skills to prepare to confront the exam. Suddenly, the exam always seems to come out of nowhere, no matter what you do, and you have to engage with it with no guarantee of success. And then it moves on like that. However, if we're looking for a much more engaging and thought-provoking and exploratory model, using the pseudoplot of the voyage and return might create a much better framework for you to get your players to action. So instead of letting them know that they are already part of this community, you're dropping them into a strange new world and letting them to explore that world and try to figure out what their responsibilities are in that world and what that world means and what is going on with the world. So it creates this pattern that helps us to move from complete novice to mastery in the design process. Let's move on to the next slide. Okay, so I appear to have missed a slide out. I was going to talk about kernels and satellites. My apologies on that one. The thing about kernels and satellites, I'll just quickly go over it before. Kernels are designed as the elements of the story that you cannot change, that you want to maintain, be the same no matter what happens. And satellites are the information around the story that can be changed without affecting the core element of the story. So in many regards, your pseudoplot gives you an example of kerneling. So we're going to have this, 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 and we're going to have this. And then how you narratively path the people to the different areas will give the different gamification approach that you're going to use in these cases. Okay. I've been now talking for about half an hour or so, and I'm sure that there are at least a couple of questions to talk about. My email address, my personal email address is here, or you can tweet me at Peadar Callaghan. You can also take a look at my personal website, peadarcallaghan.com, if you want to read some of my little blog posts about the use of game design and gamification elements inside of a learning environment and things like that. So at this point, I'm going to throw it open to the chat and ask if anybody has any questions.
Yeah, thanks, Peadar. What a fantastic insight into narrative gamification and the value it could bring to the cybersecurity industry. So, yeah, let's move on to the Q&A section of this webinar. I see we've already got a few questions in. Remember to ask your questions in the Q&A section below or in the chat directly. So the first question we have got is, what advice would you give to a first timer who wants to use gamification? Interesting question.
Okay. The advice I'd give a first timer is always KISS principle. Keep it simple. You don't have to design and program a full system in place. In fact, it's many times it's much better for you to keep it simple, design it on paper, and test bed it out on paper so that you can understand what it is that you're wanting to achieve, rather than going full scale into a productions phase where you're trying to produce everything and anything and make it all bells and whistles and make it all beautiful and everything like that. You just want it to be utilitarian to start with, simple to start with, and you can always iterate and build on it rather than trying to make sure that it's all perfect.
Fantastic, fantastic. So we've got a question from Georgius. He has asked, aren't apps like Predictors best for new gamifiers?
I'm not 100% sure about Habitia. I haven't reviewed that app myself. The problem is that how shall I put this? There are plenty of tools out there, but if you're just reaching for the tool rather than understanding what it is that you're trying to do with the tool, you can end up with everything looks like it looks like a nail to a hammer. So if you're just reaching out for the tool, you're going to just create another thing that you have seen before, which may or may not serve your purpose as well. If you're wanting to do anything that is actively engaging in learning, you really do need to think about the system clearly and carefully before you go reaching for the digital tools. I hope that makes sense to everybody.
Yeah, thank you for that, Peadar. We've also got another question from our very own Paul Barker. So Paul has asked, can you shed any light on how game could transform the effectiveness of disaster recovery simulations / desktop exercises? Thanks for that, Paul.
Yes. The thing about we're moving away from discussing gamification right at the moment and moving into my other area of interest, which is game design. Gamification, as we've seen, what you're trying to do is you're trying to nudge people into behavioral changes. You're trying to do that over a process, over a time frame. Now, if I was to try to do a large-scale multi-phase game, the similarities between that and a gamification system would be very, very similar. Sorry, I'm getting a little sidetracked there. Forgive me for a second. It depends on how we define what a game is. If we define a game as something that is going to be taking place throughout the entirety of the program, then we're looking at a simulation style game or a long multi-session game, at which point you're looking at role-playing methodology as your primary mechanics system. And you're then using those mechanics to get people to investigate the different roles that they've been assigned or the different roles that they're taking place. That's how you can engage with that one. Some suggestions, you can look at the rule of three, you can look at mirroring, you can look at reflection practices in role play design, you can look at reversals, which are fabulous in role play designs and everything like that. Crisis simulation, there's a small problem with crisis simulation. The problem with crisis simulation is you're trying to train two different things. The first thing that you're trying to train is quick response, the trained response to the stimulus response. This is the low road transfer. And if that's your case, then the game you're going to design is going to be very different from something where you're trying to get people to think about what they would do when confronted with a novel situation. So the first style of game, you're training them to recognize the situation and adapt and apply the methodology that they have learned to that situation. The second one is a novel situation where you're trying to get them to understand, conceptualize, and make connections. In the second case, you don't want time limits and you don't want stress in the training scenario. In the first case, you do want stress in the training scenario. So these are very different things. I hope that answers that question for you, Paul.
Yeah, thanks, Peadar. So we've had a few more questions coming as well. We've got two from Philip Sparks. So I'll ask the first one. Yes, there are many roles defined in NIC and organizations related to cyber. Is it wise to align game to known roles if need to actually break these outdated roles to achieve better integration of cyber resilience?
The first thing that I would say is it's always good when you have known roles, especially when you're going into a game design situation. The one thing that I would definitely say is you don't want people to be playing the role that they normally use. This is a major problem in resiliency training. Instead, because if you get the person to play only the role that they do every day, they're not actually going to become invested and engaged with learning about what it is that the other person's perspective is. This will reduce the amount of communication that you're going to, that you're going to be getting between the roles, and will reduce the ability for this to become a sort of lingua franca, a sort of method of communicating between each other. And in cybersecurity, one of the major problems that my cybersecurity expert friends tell me about is this siloization, where the very technically skilled people have this type of knowledge and the other groups have this type of knowledge, and getting bridges between those silos becomes the major problem. What you're trying to do with a good game design for cybersecurity training is, well, there are many things that you could be doing, but one of the things that you should be trying to do is create a new Tower of Babel, a method of creating a language for multiple people to discuss the issues from different perspectives and to bring their own ideas through it.
Okay, fantastic. Yeah. So we've got another question from Philip as well. Then we'll get to your question, Alistair. So Philip also asked, is game duration correlated to time needed to measure behavior change?
Again, this is a very difficult question to answer, because are we talking about long-term behavior change or short-term behavior change? Are we talking about understanding leading to behavior change? Or are we talking about an emotional understanding? If we take the concepts from Chip and Dan Heath's book, Made to Stick, the easiest ways to get people to change behavior are, in order, first of all, change the environment in which the decision processes are made. Second, get an emotional reaction in place to them. And finally, get them to understand intellectually why the decisions are being made. The problem is that in most training scenarios, we're focusing on the third and least effective methodology out there, which is explaining and getting an intellectual buy-in. Games, in contrast, encourage people to get an emotional reaction. They become what some people have described, what Sylvester Tinian describes as engines of experience. So you're having the experience, and having that experience brings that emotional reaction into you, which encourages you to internalize, and, to borrow a term from game studies and Isaac Asimov, it encourages you to grok the concept, adapt it into yourself, and become, not just understand it, but adapt it into who you are and how you behave and how you move forward with the world. So game duration, it really does depend on the game and what it is that the game is seeking to do. Of course, the biggest predictor of learning is time on task. So the more time that the person is actively engaged with the task, the more likely they are to retain the information and to be able to apply the information into the future. But it's a very difficult question to be able to say that this time measure correlates with this time measure, because of all of the variables.
Okay, thank you. I hope that answers your question, Philip. So we've got a question from Alistair Pack. He has asked, cybersecurity, like data protection, can be trained really badly. We tend to get realms of dull info via online sites. Do you think gamified training works best through software, or can it be bought into physical workshops? Great
I,
question, Alistair.
I think it should, first and foremost, the way I came to gamification, let me to answer this question from a slightly different way. I came into gamification from the perspective of being a language teacher in a country where people didn't speak the same language as me. I needed to find ways to get them to engage with something that was difficult, something that they may not have had much buy-in to, and to get them to actively engage, actively do it. Because if you're not actively doing it, you're not truly learning. I think the concept is inert knowledge from Northhead, I believe. And this idea is that inert knowledge is knowledge that you have been given, but it is unchanged and unchangeable. It resides in your brain and you don't do anything with it. And it has been argued since the 1930s that this type of knowledge is not only useless to the person, but in fact may be harmful to their ability to actually engage and learn from the situation. So you want to try engaging and active learning techniques inside of a physical workshop classroom as much as you want to do it online. Gamification should not exist in only a digital environment. It should exist in both the digital space and the real world space simultaneously so that the people can transition between those ideas. And I 100% agree that way too often the training methodology is based around chalk and talk. It is death by PowerPoint and not giving the people the chance to actively engage and experience what is known as Kolb's experiential learning cycle, which games are wonderful for doing.
Okay, I hope that answered your question as well, Alistair. So I've got a question for you, Peadar. Is gamification just a tech trend?
Yes and no. The name gamification came into existence in about 2002, 2003, and it is an ugly, ugly name. It was actually designed to be an ugly name. However, if you look at the principles behind it, the concepts behind it are fundamental to good teaching and learning practice. So the behaviorist model of learning that is used in the reinforcement cycles and the reward structure cycles has been studied since the 1900s, since Pavlov. Games for teaching, the oldest tract that I've read about games for teaching includes, comes from 1284, Alfonso X's book, in which he talks about how games help people to learn the usefulness of planning and the usefulness of understanding luck. So we've got this huge, long history where games and gamification elements have been used to teach and have been used to teach incredibly effectively. Then in the early industrial period, Taylorism came in, all of this got thrown out the window, and studying and learning had to become first the information is transferred from my brain to your brain, and then I test it by getting you to transfer it again from your brain to the piece of paper on the exam. This doesn't necessarily show the skills and the techniques that you need to be viable as a cybersecurity expert or any sort of creative expertise in the modern world. I hope that answers that one.
Okay, yeah, fantastic. Thank you so much for answering all of those questions. And I think we're just about out of time now. So I just want to say a big thank you to Peadar for an excellent talk. Lots to take away and consider, especially for cyber training providers and businesses with cyber teams. Thanks also to our wonderful audience for your attention and your engagement today. Plus, we can't forget those of you that are watching this recording later on. This recording will, of course, be sent out to you later, so you can share this around and watch it back at your own leisure. In the meantime, there should be a link in the chat now for the Cyber Lounge. And if you're not already part of it, I would highly recommend joining, as we're running many excellent events just like this, and it's a great place to network. So invite everyone over to that. Feel free to send that link to your friends, colleagues, and also feel free to connect with Peadar or myself on LinkedIn to continue the discussion further or ask any questions that you may have. But for now, that's it from us. Thank you all for joining us today in the Cyber Lounge. Have a great day, and I will see you around.
Thank you very much for coming, and please, people, feel free to reach out to me. I am available for consultation and design purposes, and I'm always happy to talk about gamification, game design, and other crazy ass ideas about how to make education and learning more engaging.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thanks, guys.